Hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Community Policing panel, focusing on women's security and safety. OneRun, the Women's UN Report Network, is very pleased to organize and sponsor this panel with the International Police Executive Symposium. And OneRun and IPES have done panels for a number of years. We've done them in Geneva and in New York, and we've done them virtual because we see the vital importance of showing the relationship of police to women's rights and, of course, to their security and safety. Global threats to democracy, justice, women's security, and climate are staggering. No longer do we live in a reactive world with peace and tranquility. There are storms of multiple calamities. But if we can create relationships on our personal, our community, our national levels, and international, we can create relationships with the police and dealing with the special challenges of our time. In all the years that OneRun has done a panel with IPES, we have never had so many wars. And police get entangled in the refugees, the migrants, the displaced people. So we're really pleased today to have several speakers who can show their unique lens on the relationship of police to women and girls. We'd also like to recognize Dr. Diana Peterson, not with us today, but absolutely a leader on this effort we've been making. She is author of Domestic Violence in International Context, which was published by Routledge. And we're now working on a second book as well. So we will start today with Michael. Michael, are you there? Okay. We will start with Dr. Michael Berlin, and he is associate professor of criminal justice, the Department of Criminal Justice and Applied Social and Political Sciences at Coppin State University. That's a long title, Michael. We're glad to hear your presentation.
Yeah. But yes, thank you very, very much. I am going to turn off the video so you will not see my picture while I'm working on the PowerPoint to save bandwidth. I'm at another conference in Chicago, so I will turn off my the video and let me. All right. So let me start off. Let's see. So we're talking about community policing in a time of crisis. And the crisis is really pretty extraordinary when you think what we have been through over the past 5 years. It's really pretty extraordinary between COVID and its impacts on daily life. While we seem to be in somewhat of a post-COVID period now, I don't think that we fully realize or understand the impact it's had on societies across the board. The political polarization in the United States and other countries, the attempt insurrection, different facts, social media, the Russian invasion of Ukraine just over 2 years ago, the recent crisis in the Middle East with Israel and Hamas, with regards to women's rights to choose in the US, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, which overturned Roe, complaints of rising crime and violence, um, immigration, the increasing distrust of the police, and conflicting demands on the police. Next slide, please. Um, okay. So with regard to incidents involving the police, there's a laundry list. I don't have to read them all. Probably best known, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd in Baltimore. We had Freddie Gray, Memphis, Tyree Nichols. So the list of incidents um, involving the police and the community, the officers in Mississippi yesterday who were convicted of torturing um, Black men. So just one incident after another. Um, my overall perspective as I think about community policing is an open systems perspective, looking at police organizations and the environments in which they exist, political, legal, social, cultural, economic, technological. And I think it really helps to understand challenges facing the police to think of these different environments, and we can relate the different factors in the climate of crisis to these different environments. Um, all right. The easiest way to understand community policing is through the historical lens, and basically reform or traditional complete policing, the professional model of policing from the 1900s through the late 70s is the basic model or paradigm that folks are familiar with. Beginning in the early 80s, this thing called community policing and problem solving came to the floor, but despite the fact that it's 40 years, there's still no common definition. And starting in the mid 90s in New York, we had a focus on CompStat, crime analysis, and crime control, something that Dr. Returno is an expert in. And related to CompStat, not quite this intelligence-led policing use of data, largely targeting offenders, but I would say the real major frames are the reform of traditional policing, community policing, and CompStat and crime control. Um, as I said, no common definition, but we typically think of community policing in terms of elements, principles and values, proactive programs and activities, changes in patrol and enforcement strategies, changes in leadership, management, and organization, which is something that we're going to talk a little bit more about today, and changes in training. Um, you know, the early community policing literature really focused on the need for transformational leadership in community policing. Leadership as an influence process, leaders with vision, commitment. There was an implication that it was supposed to be a participatory leadership style. While I personally believe in that, I'm not sure that the literature fully bears that out. It's relatively clear the mechanisms by which community policing was intended to improve police community relationships. If you treat people right, you listen to them, you improve communication, it is likely that you will improve relationships. The mechanisms by which community policing were to reduce crime were not quite as clear. In theory, if people trust the police more, they'll give more information. But more needs to be explored with that. Finally, the community policing incorporates a human resource component with fair and equitable treatment for agency employees. Um, and uh, and so community policing has never fully been embraced in the United States. But I suggest, particularly in this time of crisis, that women really stand to benefit tremendously as both members of the community as agency employees and also with regard to how they're treated as victims and suspects. So I'm going to ask my colleagues now to share a few ideas on this. And one of those ideas, it would be specifically risk instruments used for domestic violence. So, Ms. Longo, do you want to?
Hi, everyone. My name is Stacy Longo. I'm with Coppin State University, and I am a graduating student this year. I had an opportunity to work with Hopkins and a handful of other great universities across the country, looking to update the risk assessment tool used by police officers to assess whether or not a female is a victim of domestic violence, as well as what her fatality chances are. And the reason that we were going to be looking into this is because back when it was first created, we did not have the technology such as tracking systems, social media. There's definitely a lot to do in terms of updating to gender and same gender relationships and violence, and being able to add risk assessments to those tools that our officers can use as, our first responders to such violence.
Thank you, Ms. Longo. I'm going to end on a note of prospects for the future. That, the real question is, given the crisis that we're in on multiple fronts, political, legal, social, cultural, disinformation, where do we go from here? There are tremendous conflicting political and community demands for crime control on the one hand, respect for civil and human rights and women's rights on the other. We are in a stage where we are practically, not practically, we are potentially making, we're creating women as suspects to be charged with crimes based on um, abortion. And the question becomes, to what extent is a shared vision possible? How do we balance pro-choice and interest in freedom to choose reproductive health care versus another segment of society that is adamantly opposed to it? How do we balance the folks who demand crime control at all costs, without respect for civil and human rights? And the demands for transformative leadership who can somehow bring people together by first kind of focusing on the job at hand in policing, having people's voices heard, having them feel included, and then coming up with some working ideas, both for working with the public and working with agency employees. I just see tremendous challenges. And this is really a time for transformational leadership in policing. So I'm going to stop there and thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Michael. That I think it gives a good overview. One of the things that has come out in our past panels on policing and women's rights has been that the more that police have education and training, particularly on women's issues, the better they are able to create relationships in small to large towns. We know that for rural women, relationships with the police can be more challenging. They may not have the phone. They may know the police department. They may know the same people they would be calling to help them. And so there's a feeling of shame or fear of exposure. But the kinds of programs that we're hearing about today on this panel actually help to create bridging the gaps. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. John, and Dr. John Interno is going to speak to us. He is the Associate Dean of Criminal Justice at Molloy College, and he was a New York Police Department captain. That must have been a very interesting job, John. So
It certainly was, Lois.
yeah. So we look forward to hearing you speak about community policing.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about community policing and protecting women. Lois has given my basic background. I've written 8 books at this point. I've done research on women's issues and policing, and I'm going to try to bring at first a very general idea of community policing and what it is, what it can be. And then I'm going to get into more specific issues about protecting women, including domestic violence, and I'll also talk about sex crimes. So let's get started with sort of a general idea of community policing. Community policing, and this kind of fits in with Michael's previous talk. Community policing in democratic society is supposed to mean, at least philosophically, that the police work with all communities, particularly communities that have less power. So in democratic society, police are supposed to be working and balancing the idea of rights and crime control. This is not easy. There are many people that suggest crime control is the critical aspect of policing, and protecting rights is not as important, which is simply not true. When police take an oath, they take an oath to protect democracy. In the United States, is to protect the Constitution of the United States. So that comes first. That is above and beyond. So with that, there is an expectation that the police are going to work with communities because they are in democratic societies. So how do we do that? How is that supposed to happen? It's supposed to happen through something we call the social contract. Now, the social contract is not something that's generally written. It's something, though, that the police must understand. And it varies by country, by community, by individuals. This is something that the police have to have a keen political radar. They have to have a radar on understanding what the community's wants are. And again, this is different depending on the country you're from. Not every country expects or wants the exact same thing. So police in a democratic society need to have a keen understanding of what's going on in the communities that they are working with, and of course, in general, with the culture. Ultimately, the goal in any democratic society is equal protection of the law. That is, that men, women, minorities, others should all be treated the same, or equally. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but it needs to be equal. That means the courts and the police and all the criminal justice system need to be working with all peoples, not just the powerful, not just the politically powerful and so forth, but with all people, trying to understand their wants and needs. And this is throughout democratic society. This is not something that would be just the United States or the UK. This is really the goal, the ultimate goal that our founders here in the United States talk about, this need for equal protection. And of course, our 14th Amendment, after our Civil War, they talk about the need for this equal protection in the law. Now, this doesn't happen easily. In fact, in the United States, we did fight a civil war over, in part, over slavery. And it can be a very, very difficult challenge for any democratic society to work on these various things. So here in the United States, we've had a lot of issues with this, even going back to Abigail Adams, who was the wife of John Adams. She is a very powerful figure for women's rights, even during the Declaration of Independence when that's being written. But unfortunately, our founding people who wrote our Declaration and our Constitution and so forth, they didn't really go as far as someone like Abigail Adams would have preferred. Again, the wife of John Adams, and we have her letters to John Adams that point out this. But later on in 1848, just before our Civil War, in Seneca Falls, the women's movement really begins to start to gel. And at this, they sort of change everything with respect to the philosophy of the democracy, that it's not just about men, it's about men and women. And this is clear when we read the declaration at Seneca Falls from 1848, where they say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. So this has a long history. It's not an easy one. And it's one in which equality is something that had to be won. It was not a simple, easy thing. It's the same thing with our Revolutionary War and so forth, and the Civil War. Not easy things. But in 1848, this starts and it continues forward. So how should we operationalize this? How do we make this happen? Well, one of the ways we need to happen, especially through community policing, is we need to hire women officers. And we need to have those officers not being treated in a way that is unacceptable, not equal, or not respected. And one of the things that many police departments do is they create these physical tests, which don't focus on the bona fide occupational qualifications of the job. In other words, these are tests that try to weed out women. So it might be a test on upper body strength or something along those lines, but it has no correlation to the job of police officer at all. And I can tell you from my experience that women are especially good officers. They do a great job in the same way that men do. And this has to be understood. So these physical qualifications need to be related to the bona fide occupational qualifications that are necessary. Again, too much focus on upper body strength and things of that nature, but that's not because the job needs that. It's because they're looking, those that are hiring are looking to weed women out. We need to screen women in. We need to bring them in much, much larger numbers. So we need fundamental fairness in the system in order to hire women officers. And then once they're hired, they need to be treated fairly. So this means that we need laws that protect women, not just women that I'm talking about with victims and so forth, but as police officers. They need to be protected. And we're going to talk about the culture of police in a few minutes and how that can be anti-woman. And it is just a very male-dominated culture. And that's throughout the world. I've been at the UN at several conventions on the status of women. And one of the things we hear from women judges, particularly in South America, we've heard some very negative things on how they are treated. And this is something that's very important, that women be treated in a fair and equitable manner. So there is a need for EEOs, or equal employment opportunity offices to protect women from the negative stereotypes that often take place, particularly in a male-dominated culture. So it's critical that we hire officers. That's like an upfront thing, that we need to get that straight and understand that. I talked about the police culture already and the need for change there. I'm going to get into this a little bit more, and I'm going to give you specific examples later on in my talk of some incidents that have occurred where only male officers responded, causing great problems, particularly in domestic violence, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Again, it's very male-dominated profession. There's need for respect for women officers as equals, and the research has been a little bit mixed in this area. The research talks about something called the job model versus the gender model. And I've done research on this myself. And there's really support for both models. And I'll just explain it briefly. But the job model is where women just get incorporated into the police culture and they just start acting like the typical quote unquote police officer, and they fall in with the culture. But then the other model is the gender model. And this is where women bring something special to the table as police officers. And they may do that in responses to all types of incidents, including it could be a very violent incident where a man might resort to, say, physical strength or something along those lines. But a woman might be able to talk the person into just giving up the gun or the knife or something along those lines. So do they bring in a separate sort of gifts to the table, or are they just being melded in? And again, there's research in both areas, and it indicates that both aspects seem to be taking place. The police culture. Now, this is something that develops due to the dangerousness of the work environment. Police, whether we like it or not, do respond to very, very difficult situations. And because of that, they rely on one another. And I have found, and I've worked with many women officers, and I've found that they are just as good and have responded and helped in dangerous situations just as men do. And that needs to be recognized. Their gifts and their ability to do the job must be recognized. And I think we're starting to see this in democratic countries, but I think we have a lot more to go on this. The police do need to show an example to others. There needs to be some level of officers do need to stick together because of the dangerousness of the environment. And this means men and women officers, they have to rely on each other. And because of that, you get a strong police culture. Unfortunately, sometimes bad habits do take place. One of the bad habits that I talk about here is shit canning. Shit canning is where officers don't take reports. And this is going to be absolutely critical. Later on, I'm going to talk about crime report manipulation, some other aspects of policing. But if they don't take the reports up front, it doesn't matter how much data analysis and so forth that you're doing, because you're going to have garbage in, garbage out, or as I've talked about in the UK and Australia, rubbish in, rubbish out. It's essentially that if the police do not listen to the victims, you're not going to be able to properly deal with the problems that occur. So this police culture can be problematic. And I'm going to give you a key example of something that happened in New York State. This is in Nassau County, Queens. This is the Joanna Bird case. Over 13 officers were disciplined. These are some of them on the front page of Newsday. These officers all had opportunities to help a woman, Joanna Bird, from being killed. She was murdered by her husband. Each of them did not do what they were supposed to do, even though the law, as well as police policy, required them to do certain things. They didn't do it. And each of them were disciplined. It's a horrible case. But I want you to look at each of them. First, note, they're all men. Every single one of them. Not one woman had responded, and this happened over a period of years. Not one woman officer responded to the scene on this, and the detectives and some of the sergeants are not there. All were male. That seems to me to be problematic, especially when you're dealing with certain types of crimes. And one of the things, for example, sex crimes. It might be better, sometimes not, but it depends on the victim. But sometimes it's better for a woman officer to be there, for a woman to explain what happened to her. In this case, we're dealing now with 13 separate officers, numerous incidents over a period of time, and only male officers are responding to the situation, and they don't do their jobs. None of them. So in the end, Joanna was killed by her husband, who's now in prison over that domestic violence incidents over a period of time, ultimately leading to her death. Other issues on police departments, very quickly, low morale is a major issue on police departments. Officers don't want to do what they need to do because they feel as if they're going to get in trouble for doing what they do and so forth. And this is a major problem. Politicians and others need to support the police so that they're not afraid to do what they need to do. Another issue with policing is something called performance management. Michael touched upon this, but I'm going to talk about this a little bit more deeply. Performance management is where we start counting all the crimes that take place and we make it about crime control. Everything is crime control. So the police, especially the commanding officer or the CO of a precinct, is held very strictly accountable for the numbers that are going on in the precinct. Because they're held so strictly accountable, there is some issue, and I'll talk about this on my next slide, of crime report manipulation, where officers won't take reports because they're so worried about the numbers and they're not as concerned about the people. And that's where a problem occurs, where we separate the idea of a report from a human being. And this seems to happen with performance management, where we're more worried about how many reports we take rather than how many people we are actually helping. There is a good 4-part mantra that goes with this, but notice the base or the start of the 4-part mantra is accurate and timely intelligence or statistics. If you don't get the statistics, if you don't get the accurate numbers, you will never be able to stop any situation, let alone develop patterns and so forth. And these types of things have happened. I've documented them all in several books that I'll show you in a minute, internationally. So this is not just in the United States. This is throughout the world. So getting that intelligence and having officers take those reports are very important to develop patterns and so forth. And then ultimately, we want to develop tactics to deal with whatever problems we see in the reports, and then deploy our resources, and then keep assessing the situation with more statistics. So it goes back to the beginning in sort of a circle. Accurate and timely statistics, you develop your tactics, you deploy your forces, and then you assess and consistently do it until ultimately you're successful at lowering the number of crimes. Now, one of the problems with that is that lowering the number of crimes sometimes means just the number of crimes. They're not looking at the incidents. And what they do is some police, because they're so afraid of their numbers going up, because there's sort of a real pressure on them from performance management that if they don't bring the numbers down, then ultimately they won't have a career. I've documented this in 2 books. The Crime Numbers Game is a book on the New York City Police Department. And my other book is How Countries Count Crime. I've documented it in there in numerous countries, France, the UK, Australia, and many other countries have done this report manipulation because of this performance management system. And I've also written peer-reviewed articles, numerous peer-reviewed articles. That's just one that I've written, but there are many others. So the point being is that if we intend on stopping crime, any crime, including domestic violence and sex crimes, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, we've got to get those reports. So part of all of this and getting the reports is developing community trust. The police need to develop that trust so people will come to them. So if you're a domestic violence victim or you're a victim of a sex crime, you go to the police because you trust the police. But when things like this happen, who's going to trust the police? You won't even call them because the police aren't even dealing with the problem that you're bringing to them. So we need to have that building of that community trust rather than browbeating people. And this has been a problem for police and democracy in general. In the United States, we have a saying, if you see something, say something, but who's going to say something to an officer who is not building that community trust, but rather browbeating or not even listening in some cases? So now I'm going to switch the talk a little bit to very specific issues. So I kind of set the stage for what needs, some of the things that need to happen on police departments and things that we are growing, we are making changes, but throughout the world, there are these issues that are still taking place. And now I'm going to switch over to very specific issues, including family violence and sex violence. Women that are issues that are specifically have a lot more women as victims. So let's talk about what's going on with that and some basic statistics. As Lois, and thank you, Lois, for introducing me. As Lois said, I was a New York City police captain. So I have some background in all of this. And one of the issues is the number of domestic violence offenders just in the last couple of years. It's nearly doubled from 2020 to 2022. We're talking about 54,000 to nearly 100,000. So the number of offenders just in the last 3 years, last couple of years, it's skyrocketing. So something's going on. There's a problem. There are issues. We're also seeing, more importantly, look at the murders. In 2018, if we look over here, we had 54 murders. Now we see constant increasing. And if we look now at the most recent yearly statistics, we have 73 murders. This is just with domestic violence. This is not with any other types of crimes, only domestic violence. So we're seeing a huge increase in offenders. We're seeing a huge increase in homicide. So something's going on in this area that's pretty clear. And that is a major problem with domestic violence that doesn't seem to be handled correctly. And as I showed you before, what's supposed to happen with performance management is we get the accurate statistics, we develop a plan, and the plan ultimately we deploy plan, we develop tactics and deploy our resources, but ultimately we do follow-up. And that follow-up is supposed to be a reduction. We're not seeing that here. Something is not going right. There's a problem. So when police become aware, this is what's supposed to happen. The police are supposed to take reports. There's a must arrest policy and so forth. But sometimes these must arrest policies backfire, which I'll talk about soon. And I can tell you, as my experience as a police captain, there were times where officers did not follow the law, did not follow the rules, and other times where things backfired. So we do need more research in this area. So does this must arrest policy work? Well, I can tell you based on the research that it sometimes backfires. And it backfires particularly in those areas where the male is unemployed or doesn't have a job. And in those cases, it does appear that when the male comes back to the scene after being arrested and put in jail, the situation just becomes worse. And this is something that police departments need to acknowledge and start looking at more closely. So what's happening here? Well, abusers seem to be at home more. There's a lot of electronic work where the abusers are now home a lot more often. They don't even go to work anymore in many cases, or they'll go once, twice a week, but now they're constantly at home. And this just makes for more and more abuse to take place. The economic situation, of course, is getting worse. This clearly is an issue that needs to be addressed. Hotels and shelters are filled to capacity. So women that want to get away can't. There's just no place, no shelter or place for them to go because ultimately they're filled. And in the United States, there is an immigration problem and other issues where we need to make sure that if somebody is the victim of domestic violence, they have somewhere to go. It has to be done. It's got to be a priority. Children at home, and now it can be for many age, they can be older children and they're at home now as well. Fewer opportunities to address the situation, and even where those opportunities happen, the situations are falling through the cracks. So there do seem to be key problems. Minority distrust is another problem. The police need to work at building those relationships with the community. So what do we need? What do we have to do? And this kind of sums up my talk here. What needs to be done is we need ultimately a culture shift. And that culture shift is first in policing itself. The police themselves need to be open to women officers in every single country and need to treat women equally. So this is part of the issue. Bring women officers in. But secondly, and just as important, we need to make sure that the police departments themselves are listening. They're listening to the communities, they're listening to the cries of victims, and they're not just setting these things aside over and over again. Women on the job, of course, need to be treated fairly. And of course, victims need to be treated fairly. They should not be afraid to call the police, that the police won't do their job, but the police will actually get out there and do it properly. Extensive training of all officers needs to be done so that when they go to these domestic violence scenes, that we can be comfortable as a society that the officers will do what they were hired to do, that they're going to do their jobs properly. Officers will take the complaints, for example, and there will be a follow-up by a domestic violence officer or another person as should be done in as many cases as possible. We need to assess the law. We need to assess policies and so forth. We need more research in this area, not just, superficial stuff, but stuff where we can actually get our hands on what's working, what's not working. And we are seeing something's not working right now. So we need to go forward and figure out how to handle those things. And ultimately, we need to develop partnerships with the communities and the police themselves. And these need to be especially with healthcare, with the schools, where sometimes the police may not become aware, but a healthcare worker might become aware, or a child care worker, or teachers, or others become aware of the situation. And in those cases, we need to make sure that officers and somebody becomes aware so they can help any of the victims that are involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. I used to be a domestic violence advocate on the side, in addition to my regular job, and I would carry a pager, and we were on contract with the police, did some ride-alongs, but we would go around and see that they would tell us that their domestic violence cases were the ones that they didn't want, that they were the most intimidating, confusing, complicated. They can get very dangerous. And so I think that hasn't changed. Another thing is when a small town or rural area, women know the police. And maybe the police are good friends of your husband or your perpetrator. And that limits the readiness to call for police. Another thing is older women. Women, what's older? Let's say women 50 and over. They haven't had that as part of their culture to call the police for help when there was a problem. They may feel shame. They may feel fear that they won't be understood, or that people will find out. And so therefore, they are hesitant to call the police. Femicide has increased. The UN did a report on femicide and is trying to develop what we call femicide watches to better track how many are increased and what we can do about them. The tragedy that women are killed so often in the United States and in the world. I also wanted to mention one thing. I lived abroad about 12 years during the 3 COVID lockdowns. And in Italy, the police would be riding around the cities looking for people who were out and didn't have approval. Another thing is they were connected to helicopters that went over, and if they would see someone on a bicycle or walking, they'd note to the police. And that developed a sense of fear. Coming back to the US police system, I was proud to see how, at least in our area in the Midwest, we have very fine police, more women than before, and sensitive training. So thank you again for your enlightenment. And now we are fortunate to hear from a woman who has done extensive research on policing, community policing, and she is Dr. Amanda McCormick. She is the interim director of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Fraser University in British Columbia. And she, I think, has a bit of a new title. She's been on our panels before. She really can look inside the reality of the sensitivity and the challenges of women creating relationships of trust with the police.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Lois. I am also at the same conference that Dr. Berlin is at, and I am having some issues with the internet. So I'm going to turn off my video for my talk. So I apologize in advance for that, but I'll just turn that off and get my slides going. So that was a fantastic presentation by Dr. Eterno, and I think it raised a lot of really important points that I hope we get to dig into in a bit of a Q&A following the talks today. But I'm going to be talking about a more specific issue when it comes to intimate partner violence. And so the research today that I'll be talking about is focusing on strangulation, which is actually one of the major risk factors for femicide. So it is an important topic to talk about. I realize also, though, that it is a bit of a sensitive topic. And so if this is a topic that people are not comfortable with, I'll be talking for about 15 minutes. Feel free just to mute me and then come back in about 15 minutes so we can continue the conversation because this can be triggering for some people. So just to give you a bit of background, as you can see from the logos here on my slide. So I'm an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of the Fraser Valley. And so that's in British Columbia, Canada. I'm also a research associate with our Center for Public Safety and Criminal Justice Research, and I'm the commitment leader for the Peace and Reconciliation Center's community of practice on reducing domestic violence. And so through these various positions and roles that I hold, I've conducted numerous studies, as Lois had mentioned, on the issue of intimate partner abuse. And my particular focus is on trying to improve the police response, which is what I'll be talking about today. So, as first responders, how police are reporting or responding to reports of intimate partner abuse can greatly affect the likelihood that a victim survivor of abuse is willing to call them again today in the future. So today we'll be looking more specifically at how police detect and respond to strangulation. There's actually been a recent plethora of research in this area, but actually surprisingly little of this research has focused on how the police respond, which is a critical gap because they are first responders. They do play that instant role in responding to these reports and really dictating the way that a file is handled and the support that a survivor of strangulation is given. So it's important that they know more about this issue and are following, proper protocols in their response. So just to be clear, in terms of the language, it's important to make sure everybody's on the same page. So, oh, hang on, I'm just having problems advancing my slide. Just give me 1 second. I'm just gonna, the internet has frozen my computer screen. So once it catches up, I'll try to move the slide forward. But I did want to just start with talking about what strangulation is, because it is important to distinguish this from the language that victim survivors use and actually that a lot of professionals use, which is choking. These are actually different things. So when we're talking about strangulation, it's referring to the restriction of airflow or the impediment of blood circulation that occurs when pressure, pressure is placed externally on the neck. Sorry, I'm having a lot of issues with the internet. I'll get this going as soon as I can here. Oh, hang on a second. It says my screen sharing has paused, so I apologize for all these technical issues. Let's see. Okay, we can try to get that going again. Sorry, I'm having a little spinny wheel on my computer here. So can you see the screen for now though? Yeah. Lois, I can see your videos there. Yeah, yes. Okay. So I'll just keep talking about this and try to get it uploaded as soon as I can. Okay, so strangulation is the external pressure that's being placed on the neck. So this can involve, as you can see from the image here, hands that are being placed around the neck and squeezing. It can include something like a chokehold, a forearm or another limb being pressed against the neck. It can include ligature strangulation, which is where you tie something like a belt or a leash around the neck and tighten it. Regardless of the method, it's externally being placed, the pressure is being placed externally on that neck region, and it can either completely cut off or impede airflow as well as blood circulation. And I'll talk about some of the impacts of that in just a moment. Research does show that among survivors of intimate partner strangulation, this is most often done through manual strangulation, where the abuser places both hands around the neck of the victim and squeezes. So this is different than choking, but choking is more often the language that victims and survivors will use. It's how they understand it. Choking refers to an internal blockage, so something that restricts or prevents the airflow internally. So, for example, choking on a grape, choking on a hot dog, so something that's inside the throat. But choking is often going to be accidental, whereas strangulation is something that, in the context of intimate partner abuse, is done intentionally. It is a highly gendered form of crime. So the research suggests that over 90% of the victim survivors of intimate partner strangulation are women, and more than 90% of the perpetrators are men. It's also being described as a form of coercive control. So this is a tactic where an abuser will use the strangulation in order to demonstrate the power and control that they hold over that person. So literally, holding their life in their hands and choosing whether they are going to live or die in that moment. Strangulation, as I'll get to as soon as I can move on with my slides, strangulation unfortunately increases the risk of being murdered by that perpetrator by more than 700%. So it is one of the best predictors of a subsequent lethal femicide. So it's being referred to then as the last warning shot or a homicide waiting to happen. It is one of the things that police must be looking for when they respond to calls for service involving intimate partner abuse, because it should be factoring into their risk assessments and their understanding of the risk that this victim is facing going forwards. There's also risks of other kinds of outcomes as well, physical outcomes, mental health outcomes that police need to be aware of, because again, they are the gatekeepers and they are the ones that may be able to connect that victim to necessary services to address some of these potential concerning behaviors. I see that my screen has stopped again. Just give me 1 second here. Okay. Attempting to share again. Okay. So there are, as I mentioned, obviously the risk for fatality, but there's also other consequences that a victim survivor can suffer even within just seconds of strangulation. The brain needs a constant flow of oxygen. Our brain does not store oxygen within it. So any deprivation of oxygen then is going to quickly impair it. Research shows that a person can lose consciousness within just 10 to 15 seconds of being strangled. Irreparable brain injury and death can actually occur within minutes. So it is a very high-risk behavior. Strangulation can also have delayed consequences. So the pressure that's being placed upon the neck region can weaken or rupture the blood vessels, which can lead to something called a carotid dissection. These internal injuries, they increase the risk that the victim survivor is going to experience a stroke or a heart attack in the days and weeks following that strangulation. So even though they may not immediately present with any injuries that are visible, there's often internal damage that's been done that can cause irreparable harm, brain injury, and even death if left untreated. And it takes very little pressure to cause this irreparable damage. So the research shows that the average pressure in a man's handshake is around 90 pounds of pressure, but it only takes around 11 pounds of pressure placed on the carotid arteries for damage to occur. So this is very easily achievable. Not only are there a number of physical health consequences, including risk for fatality, but this is obviously a very traumatizing experience for the woman to go through. She may not be sure whether or not her partner is going to kill her. In fact, half or more of women who've been strangled by their intimate partners reported later on they thought they were going to die during this incident. So it is very traumatizing. And so the research shows that there is an increased risk for these women to experience depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as be at increased risk for suicide. Unfortunately, strangulation is common, at least in the research that's been conducted in North America, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. This is where the majority of the research has been done. We actually know very little about the prevalence of strangulation in developing countries, for example. But looking at the Canadian General Social Survey data, so this is victimization data, this data suggests that around 15% of Canadian women aged 15 years and older have been strangled by their partner in the last 5 years. These rates will vary depending on the populations that you're looking at. There's actually research with shelter populations that shows that 2/3 of women have been strangled by an intimate partner. Some of the research that I've done in British Columbia, I did a study for a police agency about the barriers to reporting victimization, and I collected data from students at my university as well as members of the community, and asked them to report on their experiences of abuse. And among students who have ever been abused by an intimate partner, 29% of them had been strangled at least once by them. And this rate was doubled in the community. So the adults that I surveyed in the community said if they were a survivor of abuse, 56% of them had been strangled at least once in the past. We know that there's higher rates amongst vulnerable populations, such as Indigenous peoples. So in Canada, our research shows that 17% of Indigenous women have ever been strangled, compared to 5.6% of non-Indigenous women. So certain populations are at higher risk. Unfortunately, then strangulation is not a rare occurrence, and it's unlikely to happen just one time. Again, as it's used as a tactic of power and control, this is something that happens often in these abusive relationships. And women report that on average, they've been strangled 5 previous times by their partner, again, who is using it as a tactic of power and control. So despite being a relatively common occurrence then amongst women survivors of intimate partner abuse, there's actually historically been little to no training for the police, which obviously is a very critical gap. As frontline responders, police officers are often that first and maybe even the only point of contact for a victim survivor of intimate partner abuse. We know that there are numerous barriers to reporting victimization to the police. When women do it is often because the violence they fear it's going to end their lives. They need the violence to stop. And so in that moment in time, they're willing to call the police, but they're not necessarily willing to continue on, with criminal justice processing. This may be the only time that they are willing to talk to somebody about their abuse. So as frontline responders, then police have an important role to play in terms of intervening when strangulation is detected and ensuring that proper steps are followed to reduce the risk that the women are facing. So police should be in a position to identify if strangulation has occurred. However, the research suggests that police often don't know when strangulation has occurred. Women may describe it, but not state that they were strangled. For example, they might say, he grabbed me by the neck. Without training, police may not necessarily pick up on the fact that this is strangulation and that they should be investigating it further. But more commonly, strangulation actually doesn't leave a mark on a lot of victims. And so it may not be obvious to responding police officers unless they ask directly about it that strangulation occurred. So in one of the seminal pieces of work on this topic, Gail Strack with the Training Institute for Strangulation Prevention in San Diego, they conducted a study in the early 2000s where they reviewed 300 files involving strangulation by intimate partners. And of those 300 files, half of the victims showed no visible external injuries. And then a further 35% of those files had injuries that were determined to be too minor for the police to actually photograph. So there is a real lack of obvious evidence then that a woman has experienced strangulation. When there are injuries, they are typically minor and not necessarily easily recognized or interpreted as a sign of strangulation. So for example, there might be abrasions on the chin or scratches on the forearm of the perpetrator, but without the training to understand that this might be indicative of a strangulation, police may not be picking up on this. As Dr. Eterno mentioned in his presentation, it's important that police do follow-ups when they have had reports of domestic abuse. This is actually really critical for strangulation because many of those injuries, if they do appear, will happen in the hours or days following the strangulation. So it may be 24 to 48 hours before you start to see the bruising appearing. So it's really important that police return and actually do these follow-up visits and document the evidence that is now starting to present. But what we know is that a lot of agencies don't have these policies or don't follow through on these policies. So they may be calling the victim, for example, but not actually following up in person, and they may be missing out on seeing these injuries. Research also shows that visible injuries may be much more apparent on victim survivors with lighter colored skin tones. So in a study that Brady et al. Did using data collected from the Austin Police Department in Texas, They found that visible injuries of strangulation were significantly less likely to be detected amongst the victims with darker skin tones. So in this study, it was victims who were African American. So it's important then that we're training police not just to look for signs of strangulation like red marks around the neck, but that they also learn about the various symptoms and signs that might be presented or stated by the victim, such as that, again, that the assailant grabbed them by the neck, that it hurts them to swallow, that it's difficult for them to breathe, that they lost consciousness during the event, if they're feeling dizzy or have a headache now. These are all signs and symptoms of a potential strangulation, and they should trigger additional questioning to determine whether strangulation may have occurred. The research shows that because of the lack of training that police have in this area, they are missing a number of these strangulation files. So there was a study done by Pritchard et al. In Florida, where they examined nearly 600 intimate partner abuse files to see what proportion of those files involved strangulation. So what they did is they coded through the files to see whenever something like strangulation or choking was mentioned. And then the researchers dug further into those files to look for things like the victim said that the assailant grabbed her by the neck or squeezed her neck, or they looked for documentation of possible signs or symptoms of injuries, such as the victim saying that she had a sore throat or that she lost control of her bladder or bowels, for example. And what they found were gaps. About 12% of the files had explicit strangulation documented by police. This is where the police officer knew that strangulation had happened, and so they documented it in the file. The researchers found another 17% of cases where strangulation was likely based on the information that was contained in the file, but the police officer had not picked up on this and so had not investigated it further or documented it. Many of the files, when they did document strangulation, used the outdated term of choking, which again refers to a different mechanism of injury and is more likely accidental and not an intentional form of power and control. And more than 1/3 of these files contained no further information on how the strangulation occurred, which would then make it problematic if they were to try to prove this in court through strangulation legislation that's been introduced in many jurisdictions. So there's a lot of gaps then in strangulation being detected by police and in the quality of information that they're recording about it. So this means we're missing important intervention points to identify, first of all, that strangulation has occurred, and secondly, to connect the victims to survivor to the necessary medical care to detect whether they have these possible, hidden internal injuries. We're also missing information that could be extremely relevant to understanding the risk for lethality that victim is facing. She is now 700% more likely to be killed by her partner because she has been strangled. This must factor into risk assessment and case management decisions. And although we know that jurisdictions across North America and New Zealand, Australia, they have now introduced legislation that specifically criminalizes strangulation, but unless the police are thoroughly documenting how the strangulation occurred, what was said or done during the strangulation, what injuries resulted, what signs or symptoms the victim was presenting with, we're unlikely to see much success in terms of obtaining convictions. So it is important then that police receive training on this topic. Research thankfully does suggest that training can result in an increase in both the quantity and the quality of strangulation occurrences identified by the police. So Rechtenwald et al. In Florida, they trained officers and found that the proportion of strangulation files detected by police increased following training. In our own research, we've seen shifts in language following training where officers are more likely to use the term strangulation rather than choking and more likely to document symptoms like petechiae, for example. We've also conducted 2 studies with frontline police officers in British Columbia about their knowledge in regards to strangulation and their practices in regards to file management. And what we found is that following the implementation of a strangulation module in the intimate partner abuse training that all police in the province are required to complete, nearly 100% of the officers surveyed were able to correctly identify the signs and symptoms of strangulation. And they understood the importance of connecting the victim survivor to medical care. In addition, the research that I mentioned earlier by Brady et al. In Texas found that using a strangulation protocol that guides how to document the signs and symptoms of a strangulation, resulted in frontline officers being able to document signs, symptoms, and injuries in around 85 to 95% of all strangulation files. So massive improvements in their documentation of these injuries. They did not measure the impact on charges or convictions, but obviously improved quality of these files is more likely to result in more cases going to court and more convictions for strangulation-related offenses, which is really important as we need to hold these abusers accountable for this very dangerous behavior. But training in this area is not common. We do it in British Columbia, but this was just introduced a couple of years ago, and many other jurisdictions, I mean, they have very little training for police on intimate partner abuse in general, let alone more specifically a module on strangulation. And the training is not necessarily closing all of the gaps. So our research found that police officers, as I mentioned, recognized the signs and symptoms of strangulation when it was listed on paper, but they were not as good at picking up on implied strangulation when provided to them in scenarios. So in our research, we surveyed police officers and we gave them a couple of scenarios. In one of the scenarios, the victim stated that she was strangled by her intimate partner during a sexual assault. That's the stated strangulation scenario. In a second scenario, which we call the implied strangulation scenario, the victim stated that during an assault, her partner pressed his forearm against her throat and she found it hard to breathe. Her throat is now hurting and she sounds raspy or hoarse. We then had the police rate the significance of the threat to life in these two scenarios and also rate the importance of a medical exam. And what we found is that the police officers rated the stated strangulation scenario as significantly higher risk than the implied strangulation scenario, even though both of these situations involved a high risk situation where the victim may now be suffering from internal injuries and is at risk of being killed by her partner in the future. Similarly, the police were significantly more likely to recommend a medical exam in the stated scenario than they were in the implied scenario, meaning that there is a missed opportunity to obtain the necessary medical care to screen the victim survivor for potential internal injuries that may be posing an ongoing threat to her life. So what this suggests is that we need more training for police, but we also need better training for police. So in our case, in British Columbia, police officers complete a course online where they are reading information about strangulation, about its relationship to intimate partner abuse. They're learning about the potential offense codes that they may be able to apply, and then they have to pass a test. Once they pass the test, they've completed their training. This is not the best way to accomplish training for officers, as made clear from the research, where they are doing great on the test in terms of being able to recognize the signs and symptoms of strangulation. But when presented with scenarios that describe these, they're not picking up on these as being indicators of possible strangulation. So at the very least, we recommend that training touch on these various areas to help police understand the relevance of strangulation to intimate partner abuse, understand the relevance in terms of the potential lethality for that victim, understand the risks it poses to the victim survivor and the need for them to be connected to medical care. They need to know how a victim may describe or present once they've been strangled, because the likelihood that they are just going to outright state that they've been strangled is quite low. And all of this needs to be done in a way that provides officers with an ability to actually engage in the material and receive feedback and not just be, passed based on some test after reading some information. So I mentioned a few of our studies. If you saw on the slides, it said they were forthcoming. We're just finishing up our report and some papers on this topic. So please feel free to email me at the address here, or you can check out our websites as well to see or to keep up to date with some of the research that we're doing on intimate partner abuse. And hopefully there's some time for questions after this. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amanda. I hope that you will send me at OneRun, the Women's UN Report Network, the summary of your presentation. If it's in a PowerPoint, I'll need a link. But I know truly that this is an area that needs to be explored more. And with the increase in femicides, there are many different ways that women are attacked and even killed. One of the recurring factors that we saw, one of the most dangerous times for a woman is if her perpetrator, if her partner or her husband, whoever, has abused her and she went to court and they sent him to jail, then the dangerous time will be when he gets out and he'll want to come back and get her and maybe the children. And so this is just a tragedy of our times, but I think we absolutely must be more attentive to the link between police and civil society, especially women and girls. I would like to also bring up a question for all of you who have spoken eloquently on this panel. But Wonder has done several events on violence, online violence against women, technical violence. It has become rampant and horrific and has resulted in some younger women actually committing suicide. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say about that, because it's a growing phenomenon we must address.
Sure. I mean,
Go ahead, Dr. McCormick.
Okay, I'll just be quick. We found this as well in that student survey that I mentioned when I asked about the forms of abuse that they were experiencing. The three most common forms of abuse were coercive control and various forms of criminal harassment. And so this, online as well as in person. And so this is definitely an issue people are facing. I think I'm actually presenting in about an hour on the topic of coercive control. Which is something that we are talking about criminalizing in Canada, following other jurisdictions that have done so. This is an issue that encompasses multiple forms of abuse, and it's really all about controlling, following, isolating that individual. So what you're speaking about, Lois, is absolutely part of this coercive controlling behaviors that we need to pay more attention to. Only a few countries or jurisdictions so far have criminalized it, and it's under a significant debate right now in Canada as to whether we should, and if we should, how should it look? And so I think we're going to hopefully be addressing this in the future.
Thank you very much. Being in British Columbia, you are in one of the regions of Canada, provinces, that has a very high percentage of Indigenous women. And we did a panel last week, on violence against Indigenous women. And we showed a picture that had probably 50 small pictures of women who were either missing or murdered. Missing or murdered seems to be the language. And in reading some of the reports on this, I see that there have been questions about how the police handled the Highway of Tears, for instance. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. There's obviously the impact of colonization in Canada. It's still resonating for many Indigenous peoples today, and this is creating very unsafe living situations for them, as well as left a legacy of conflict between Indigenous peoples and the police. We've actually done research looking at the barriers to reporting victimization amongst Indigenous women to the police about intimate partner abuse. And so this theme, does come up, that they don't truly understand colonization, the impacts, the legacy that it's left, how it's still affecting us today. I was thinking about this quite a bit during Dr. Eterno's presentation, because of course he was talking about mandatory arrest policies. And actually mandatory arrest policies themselves are also a barrier, and uniquely so for Indigenous women, in that those who are still in a current intimate partner relationship, who don't want to see that relationship have to come to an end for a variety of legitimate reasons, will not report victimization to the police because of fear of how her partner will be treated by the police officer. So it is a very distinct barrier. So I don't know, Dr. Eterno, if you want to add to that, but absolutely, there's a need for more training, a need for more awareness about how this is still a very real problem today.
Yeah, the must arrest policies really go back to the old Minneapolis domestic violence experiment, where they show, it is old, but there's been a lot of critique on this. And the main critique is especially for those, if the man is not working and he's arrested when he comes back, that's the time where it's the most danger. And Lois, you were talking about this as well. It's really It's not the best way to handle domestic violence at this point. We need a lot more research, like what Dr. McCormick is doing, to see what is successful and what's not. But I think the worst of all the worlds is not getting the reports in. That's the big problem. And in the case of what Dr. McCormick's talking about, it's the police just aren't trained to properly get it. In my case, what I've noticed is that police officers sometimes purposely do not take the reports because they simply don't want to have that large number of incidents on their record for that particular precinct. So the commanding officer discourages it, or they may just change the report, a few words or something like that. And this has been particularly true for sex crimes victims. We've had a major problem in New York where their reports, the information about the sex crime is not put into the report because the commanders are very worried about having too many sex crimes in their commands. So with that information pulled out, there had to be some way of recognizing that a pattern of sex crimes are happening. And in one precinct, a detective arrested a perpetrator, a rape perpetrator, and the perpetrator admitted to 7 other crimes in the precinct, rape crimes. So he goes back to the file to close out the 7 other rape crimes. He goes back and all of them, all 7 of them, did not have the sexual parts of the crime listed in them, and they were all listed as criminal trespass. So for me, I do think training is a part of this, absolutely, and I totally agree with the Dr. McCormick, excellent presentation. But my worry is that even when the officers are properly trained, there are other pressures on them not to take these reports, particularly in a performance management type of system. And again, I've seen this, including in Canada, by the way. I've seen this throughout the world. And again, it's all documented. I've documented it in my book, How Countries Count Crime. And my worry is if we don't get that accurate and timely statistics, we are not giving the detectives and others who really want to stop these things the opportunity to do so. So yes, I do think training is absolutely a part of it, but I also think the pressures on police, these types of pressures and not taking the reports, that needs to go away. Well, we need to make sure that our officers are taking those reports. Yes, we don't miss those opportunities, and then we can develop those patterns where we can go back and particularly with homicide, obviously, but in all crimes. I think that this is an issue, especially in sex crimes. We've seen it over and over again.
Thank you for that. I think all of the speakers have referenced the fact that there are many types of abuse and crime against women. And when you know the person, when your abuser is someone in your family or someone who could hurt your children, there will be a hesitancy to report. And as you just said, regarding orders for protection, in which the abuser must stay away from the home and the work of the victim. But a woman is reticent to ask for her abuser to be imprisoned or taken to court, charged, if he is paying for the house they live in. And that also becomes delicate when they talk about order for protection, who gets to stay in the house. I mean, it's a very complicated web of issues on domestic violence, and yet they're so common and they're increasing. And we know that many women who are in prison are there because they were trying to defend themselves in a domestic violence case. I think it would be nice if we would ask each of the speakers today to give us just a few more words. We have a little time, and whether the technical issue is making a difference in the police work, and also the issues of religion, sexuality, and race. we see in the women's movement tensions that can occur over one's sexuality in modern times. So, do you want to start with a few words, or shall we go back? How do you wish?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. First, since this is about community policing, I do think the police need to build community trust. And in many
Yes.
communities, it's not
Mhm.
there. You know, it just doesn't exist. You talked about rural communities, but I think this is true, not just in, I think it's just true in general, that there's a lack of trust in the police, that when you call them, that you're going to get the professional service that we all expect. And I've seen this even in departments that I thought were very professional. And yet they respond even on simple calls, burglary calls and other types of things where they're treating the victim in a way that they should never be treated. You know, well, why did you leave the house? You know, questions like that are just, you know, crazy.
What were you wearing?
Yeah, exactly the type of thing. So building that community trust is so important because the reluctance to report is there. And in general, it's cultural. You know, most people, even if they see something, they don't want to say something because they don't want to get involved. And if the police don't develop that trust and say, look, it's okay to report to us, it's okay to let us know about these things, and we want you to report those things, people still have a reluctance. And I think that's throughout democratic society, this reluctance to get involved because it will invoke the criminal justice system. And the system itself obviously has issues and problems, but ultimately it's up to the police. And I think the police, in my view, have not done as good a job as they can in developing those relationships with people so that people will come to them, that they will open up to them,
Yes.
that they feel secure with them. People don't. And in some cases, particularly minority areas, you were talking about indigenous, a lot of these minorities and other areas, there is so little trust of the police that the police are never called. And that's got to change. And I think that if we don't build that trust between the communities and the police, we're not going to have any change. And that's where it starts. So I do think the police have a responsibility to the people in and I talked about the social contract earlier, but to ultimately work with the communities and have them trust that they will do the right thing. And I think that's critically important if we want ultimately to stop these incidents, and if we want ultimately for patterns to be developed, you have to get that initial trust. And I don't think in many communities, in the United States, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, and I do think with indigenous peoples in particular, there's just a lack of trust and colonization. Dr. McCormick brought that up. Absolutely issues that still remain culturally in these communities.
Oh, Lois, you're muted.
Lois, you're muted. We do have a question, Lois.
Yeah, that's
that
what
came in.
I pulled it up. Is this from the anonymous attendee?
Yes, and
Yeah.
I think it might be very good to go along with what Dr. John was talking
Right.
about.
Would you like to read it, please,
I
Sarah?
certainly can. It says, in Ontario, specifically the Thunder Bay, there has been evidence to support racism and systemic violence within the police force. Recommendations include transparency, training, and community consultation. Yet, the provincial government takes a more tough on crime approach and does not fund this work, but funds Guns and Gangs Unit, where evidence suggests community-based policing is more effective. So here's the question. How do you suggest that governments work together to make change in policing? How do you convince governments of community policing?
I think that's a great question. And I think part of it is the political will has to be there. If it's not, you can just pack your bags and leave. You know, if the political powers that be are just not behind this and they don't realize the importance of it, because the get tough message, that's been the message for the last like 15, 20 years. We've started to see some level of change with that more recently with Black Lives Matter and so forth in the United States. But this Get Tough on Crime is very popular amongst police. So if you talk to a police chief and you say to the police chief, what is your most important job? Invariably, they say, well, I bring down crime. But that's not right. You know, yeah, of course, bringing down crime is important, but you have to bring down crime while at the same time protecting due process rights. And in a democracy, that's the tough part. You know, it's the second part that's tough. It's very easy to bring down crime. We just don't respect people's rights. In New York City, we had something called stop and frisk, which was just abused here tremendously, especially in minority communities. Sure, you'll bring down crime, but at what cost? And it's at the cost of losing that community trust. And that's where we're at right now. We're not at a place where officers and particularly police chiefs. So, and I wish Michael was here because he talked about transformational leadership. That's exactly what's needed. The person at the top needs to stress the importance of not only stopping crime, but stopping crime at the same time protecting basic rights. And that's the trick. Again, anyone can stop crime. We just make a draconian law to chop people's hands off for something who do crimes. You won't have any crime. But doing it, stopping crime, while at the same time protecting individual rights, respecting individuals, going into the communities and working with them, that's tough. It's tough. And without the backing of the politicians, and I mean mayors, and police are generally part of the executive branch, depending on the country, but they're generally part of the executive branch. Without that support, police are not the tail that wags a political dog. It's not how it works. The police follow along. You know, if the politicians are saying one thing, the police, okay, that's what you want, you know, I'll do that. The police are not going to make the change on their own. They need the support. And I think one of the areas of support, first, you do need these enlightened leaders. That's number one. But beyond that, the leaders need to get the support of the mayors, the politicians, and the rank and file. That's not easy either because you have a police culture that is very, very anti, you know, going into the communities and doing all sorts of things. Most of these officers, they're, in general, and I hate to stereotype like this, but in general, they just want to finish their day out, sign out, and be done. They're not going to do things that are going to stick their neck out. They're going to do what they're told. And most officers follow the leader. So if you have a transformational leader, I think that's the key. And that transformational leader ultimately has to do their best to get the mayors and political will, and also get the people behind it. And one last final point on this: I have not seen, and I love the idea of being transparent, but very few police departments are that transparent about what goes on. And you can just ask researchers, can I do research in this particular? If they aren't comfortable with the researcher, they're not going to let you in. So the research that I've seen is often not as critical as maybe it should be, because they're worried about losing access to that police department. And that's another issue, kind of a whole conversation on that. But understand that it's not a simple thing, and it's a tough question. And I do think that transformational leadership is part of it. And I do think grassroots movements in the communities, that too is critically important. And then some level of support for the police. It's important. But understand that I do think many officers want to do the right thing. They go in with very good hearts, and then they hit a police culture that is just not willing to change. And it's status quo, status quo, status quo. We are seeing some changes. I have seen it, and it can happen, but it is certainly not easy.
We have a comment in the chat. I'd like to ask if Fatima Salia would like to say something. She wrote in the chat, no to police, and then I see a flag. Looks like UK, but I'm just wondering. Okay,
Lois, I just want to let you know that we're out of time.
we are out of time.
Yes.
Out of time, but not out of work. We know there's lots yet to do, and this is a field that we will pursue further with different approaches to the police and civil society relationships. And as for Amanda, I think that George Floyd was choked, strangled, and he was in my community. At another time, I would also like to look at women in prison because, and the drug issue, drugs, narcotics, and substance abuses, how they affect crime against women and policing. So thank you so much for coming today. You are absolutely experts and you've got experience, and this is exactly what we wanted to do.
Thank you for inviting me, Lois.
On this panel.
Thank you very
today
much.
For
Thank
the
you.
UN Commission on the Status of Women. Thank you all. Bye-bye.